All right, I think we have a number of folks on. So good morning or good afternoon, wherever in the country you are. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jen Carnig. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the president of Spitfire Strategies. We're an advocacy and communications firm. I'm based out of New York, and it's truly a pleasure to be with you today. We're having a webinar format today. So what that means is, we've all been in a million webinars over the past several years, I'm sure. But the idea for this session today is to really make it truly interactive. So we're going to do some talking at the top, but really try to make space for all of you to really bring your ideas and engage in conversation and hear your expertise as part of this session. We know you really have the deep expertise and thinking that can be the most useful to you all. So we're going to talk a little bit, then we're going to make space to turn it over to you all. We are recording right now, but we'll stop recording after the presentation period. That's just so that you then will have the comfort to say whatever you think needs to be said. And we're viewing this kind of like a breakout session from the convening that you were at. So the idea is that whatever happens is really going to stay here. We're not going to be reporting out or sharing anything anybody said, again, so that we can have that really kind of meaningful and juicy conversation to support all of us in our work. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speakers today. And first, I'm going to ask Michael Crawford if you want to do a quick intro, and then we'll hear from Chris and then Quintin.
Thanks, Jen. Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Crawford. I am a vice president at Spitfire Strategies, which means I'm lucky enough to work with Jen. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm also based in New York City, and a lot of my work, or the thing that I'm most interested and excited about right now, is building cultural momentum for social change. Prior to Spitfire, I worked for a political organization called Move On, and I also worked in the marriage movement.
And then Quintin Williams. I'm sorry, I actually was going to do order. My fault. Chris Alexander.
I appreciate that, Jen. It's all good. Hey, everybody. I'm Chris Alexander. I am the executive director of the New York State's Office of Cannabis Management. Born and raised here in New York. I spent a couple of years working on the advocacy side related to criminal justice reform, prison reform, and drug policy reform. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Jen, and glad to be here with both you, Michael and Chris. My name is Quintin Williams. I am a program officer at the Joyce Foundation in our Gun Violence Prevention and Justice Reform Program.
All right, this is such great company to be in. Michael, if I could kindly ask you to put up our deck. We're here today to talk about narrative change and just kind of want to do a brief once over about what that actually means, right? What is narrative change? It's something I think we all hear a lot about, and maybe not everybody even necessarily knows what it is we're talking about or why it's important to our work. So I mentioned that I work at Spitfire, and we're an advocacy and communications organization that supports individuals, organizations, and campaigns to create progressive change and really to win, right? We were founded 21 years ago because campaigns and organizations at the time with great visions and great track records of changing laws or winning lawsuits, they still weren't seeing the change that they really wanted. They were winning the day, but they weren't really winning hearts and minds. And that's the key, right, to long-term change. You could win at the ballot box, you can win good stories in the newspaper, but if you don't have a bigger plan and vision, you can't make the real change that you're looking for. So what we're going to talk about really quickly today and at really high level are some of those principles to think about when you're trying to change something big, like creating safety or alternative response in your community. I'm sorry, yeah, you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So one of the most important ideas that we want to kind of just lift up today really is this notion that I think all of us really know in some way is that facts alone don't matter. They aren't enough. You can't just say a fact and get somebody on your side and to share your perspective. We can see very easily measure that the global temperature is warming or see that ice sheets are shrinking and the sea level is rising. But if people don't believe it, climate change isn't real. It's just like we can look at election data and count votes, and that's not enough. There are still going to be plenty of people that just won't accept the results. And that's really because of how we see the world. Slide. And I know everybody thinks, we know what stories are, so why are we here even talking about it? But stories are the main way that we understand ourselves and we see the world around us. They're the reason that we can look at the stars in the sky, and instead of seeing balls of light, we can see epic battles and tales of monsters and love lost and found. Just slide. Thank you. Stories, we know what they are. They describe an event, they have characters, there's a conflict, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, but they're more than that. They're how we understand ourselves and they're how we understand the world around us. And if you think back even just to cave drawings, there's something that humans have always used to make sense of the world around us. So stories are an integral part of anything that we're going to do. And stories are also really at the heart of what narratives are. Slide. Thank you. So narratives are the ideas and the themes that permeate collections of stories. I like this picture because I feel like that's the roots that are feeding the tree. It's these collections of stories that fuel what narratives are. They're the ideas that can appear in any structure and are articulated and refined repeatedly in a variety of stories and messages. So narratives are kind of these bigger ideas behind the stories, things like gender, race, pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, freedom, our sense of belonging. That all comes through in narratives. And I always find the most helpful way, thank you, to understand a narrative this is my favorite example, is Jaws, right? So Jaws is a story about that insatiable man-eating shark. But the bigger narrative that we have about sharks is that stories about insatiable man-eating sharks add up to the narrative of sharks being dangerous predatory creatures. So all the collections of the stories about sharks give us this idea, and Jaws is just one example. And a way I like to really explain, another way I think about it's fine, you can just put it up. For me, one of the most supportive ideas besides Jaws to think about when I'm thinking about narrative is to kind of spend a little time thinking about what the American dream is. It's one of the most ubiquitous narratives in American culture. The narrative that in America, everyone has the opportunity to achieve their dreams if they work really hard enough, right? And that's deeply embedded into everything that we do here and all modes of storytelling within the United States and really around the world. And it doesn't matter if it's true or not. No facts or data move our understanding of the American dream. So even if it fails to acknowledge barriers and oppressions that face people, we believe that it's true. We believe the American dream. And so that's an example of a narrative, one of these collections of stories that help us make sense of ourselves and the world around us. And so, Michael, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about kind of how narrative can fit into how we work on an issue or a campaign.
All right. Hey, everybody. Had to quickly stop sharing my screen in order to come off mute. But I'm so happy to be here today. Again, my name is Michael Crawford. I am Vice President at Spitfire, where I work with Jen. And I mentioned a moment ago that I used to work in the marriage movement, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But I just wanted to reiterate one of the things that Jen pointed out, which is that narratives help us shape what people think about, how they think about it, and what should be done about it. And that's something that we should keep in mind throughout the entirety of this conversation. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we did at an organization called Freedom to Marry. At Freedom to Marry, I was the Director of Creative and Digital, which means that a lot of my work focused around storytelling. And I'm going to share with you a couple of pieces of Freedom to Marry's work and how they connected to the overarching narrative that we were trying to advance as we were working to win the Freedom to Marry. And I'm going to go through these next 4 or 5 slides really quickly, for which I apologize, but I'm also going to share a link to the Freedom to Marry website when I stop sharing my screen so that you can see we turned the site into a repository of lessons learned and tips and from all the things that we learned. So one of the most important things that I think for Freedom to Marry and the work that we did around marriage was that we had a very clear goal that was framed in the affirmative. Freedom to Marry was a campaign to win marriage for same-sex couples nationwide. Super easy to remember. And it told people clearly what we were about to do. And in that, the image that's on this slide, you'll see the words, America is ready for the freedom to marry. And I'm going to come back to that in a second, because that was essentially our closing argument as the Supreme Court was considering legalizing marriage nationwide. And so Freedom to Marry also had a clear narrative that was rooted in shared values. So originally the movement was we talked about rights, we talked about not amending state level constitutions to ban marriage, we talked about, you know, the benefits of marriage. But a part of what we also did was we did a lot of research talking to people who were in that squishy, persuadable middle kind of category, aka straight people, to find out what they thought about marriage, why they thought same-sex couples wanted to marry. And one of the things that we found out was that they thought same-sex couples wanted to marry for what they considered to be the wrong reasons, that they wanted for it to make a point about civil rights, that they wanted it for the tax benefits, that they wanted basically for reasons that they saw as different from the reasons that they wanted to get married. And so we shifted our messaging based on that research from one talking about rights to one focused on love, family, and commitment. We took that messaging, as I pointed out, was developed from intensive research over a number of years, and we continued to refine the messaging over the course of the Freedom to Marry campaign, and we translated that all into compelling stories like the one the photo that you see of Elaine and Mignon on this slide. Now, Freedom to Marry's strategy was also a core piece of the narrative. We often talk about strategy in our campaigns and in our movements, but we do so in a way that is complicated, and we do it in a way that we don't really share widely what we're doing and how we're doing it. And I mentioned a moment ago that Freedom to Marry had the very simple and clear affirmative goal of winning marriage for same-sex couples nationwide. And so our strategy was the narrative that we used to get us there. And we branded it as the roadmap to victory, and we shared it widely. And when I say we shared it widely, in every single piece of social media content, in every video that we created, in every interview that representatives or the organization did, for TV or newspapers or podcasts, etc., we constantly reiterated, this is our strategy, this is how we'll win. Now, of course, when we were talking to donors, or we were talking to our allies in the movement, we went much deeper into the strategy, but the strategy was very clear. We were going to win marriage in more states. We were going to grow public support, and we were going to end federal marriage discrimination. And we didn't see that as a 1, 2, 3 kind of approach. We saw it as 3 tracks that we were operating on simultaneously, with each track feeding and supporting the other tracks. And we made super clear that our supporters, from people who simply signed a petition, all the way up to supporters who could give us $1 million, and our friends on Capitol Hill knew what that strategy was. And then we also had clear ways for people to participate. Our narrative invited people to share their stories as a part of the work that we were doing. I mentioned previously that our final argument to the public, as lawyers were arguing their final arguments in the Supreme Court, was America is ready for the freedom to marry. And we used the stories from all over the country. So not just stories from big cities like New York City, Los Angeles, San Francisco, but everywhere from my hometown of Houston to Montgomery, Alabama, to Louisville, Kentucky, all sharing stories that were rooted in the shared values that I mentioned earlier, and that were really about love, commitment, and family, as you see here with this super adorable couple. And in addition to it bringing those stories, bringing our narrative to life, they were also a form of social proof where people could see that people just like me supported the freedom to marry for same-sex couples. And with that, I believe that's our last slide. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'll share the Freedom to Marry website in the comments in a moment.
Thank you, Michael. It's so helpful to hear that marriage case study. I think it really brings so much of what the narrative change work to life. And we're going to have the chance now to hear another case study. So, Chris, I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about the work that you're doing in New York. And when we met last week, you were even kind of talking to me a little bit about word choice, thinking about cannabis and marijuana and, what each signals. And so I'd love to just hear from you a little bit about how we have seen narrative change operate in the case of marijuana legalization.
Yeah, no, again, thanks for having me. And thank you all for joining us. The fight for legalization is pretty similar in terms of scope of connection, the way that people connected individually to the issue as the fight for gay marriage. I say that because part of the narrative relied on the fact that individuals had their own individualized experience, their own individualized stories, somebody in their family who had been impacted by the issue. And there was also a larger societal dialogue going on that we were kind of jumping into. And so, as it relates to narrative change for legalization, I think one thing had to be clear is that the end goal of the fight, the campaign, and I'll talk a bit about the Start Smart New York campaign that I built that ended prohibition in the state, but the broader fight, the language around freeing the plant had been around for decades. So people essentially had a connection to or an understanding of those who wanted to end prohibition, but narrative change, what I want to kind of focus on is the fact that that end goal focus without the intermediary steps really allowed folks to kind of dismiss it as a fringe issue. When the conversation was solely from, the advocates of the 70s and the late 60s, the hippies, et cetera, when it was just their voice and it was just freeing the plant, it allowed folks to disassociate and disengage with the movement altogether. And what we had to focus on was how do we help folks take the intermediary step to understand that this issue is broader than just, having a good time and freeing this plant. And I think that was really the challenge, right? It was helping folks to understand that, while we are talking about this substance that you are familiar with, that society has normalized in many ways, media has normalized, you have to understand that the conversation around it is much more nuanced than you think. And so by pulling people into the step-by-step, it actually got us a lot more supporters. For example, for a long time, criminal justice advocates had minimized marijuana legalization itself within that broader conversation. And it wasn't, I don't think it was intentional historically. It was just, there were, things that were, much more significant, like, reforming the death penalty and crack cocaine sentencing laws and all these things that were, more challenging. But the thing that helped us kind of move the conversation along is just the sheer scope and the size of what the issue became here in New York City, which we call the marijuana arrest capital of the world. The fact that the state and the city, specifically the NYPD, were arresting tens of thousands of young people every year allowed us to really take that intermediary step. It was like, well, hold on, there's a conversation happening here before the conversation. And so for us, the key narrative changes that we had to discuss is, even though people kind of generally conceptualized, marijuana as not that bad, we had to lay out for them the fact that the current policy, as it was being implemented, was incredibly terrible and harmful for communities. And so by bringing folks into the intermediary, the step-by-step, it allowed for more folks to understand that this policy position and this approach to this issue had to change. There's, kind of something, a parallel that I want to draw that I think is helpful, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately, but it's, the fight for universal healthcare, right? Which obviously necessary, important, all that good stuff, but the focus sometimes on the final goal can detract from getting some of the necessary folks on board and accepting of the necessary policy change. I think that there's some key differences. Of course, we still got our full goal. So I know the fight over there is still ongoing. But in talking about the messaging around the Affordable Care Act and the policy change that came there, folks who, even though they opposed universal health care generally as a concept, because they largely didn't understand it, did accept certain key principles of that fight. For example, that folks were shouldn't be discriminated against for pre-existing conditions. Right now, in today's conversation, that is a pretty acceptable fact that folks on both sides of the aisle can appreciate. When I come back to marijuana legalization, one thing that kind of was an intermediary step that was necessary and became helpful was folks recognizing the medicinal benefits of the plant, right? Which was a thing that allowed us to kind of disassociate the need for this policy with reality. And so, in getting folks to understand and advancing medical programs and folks to understand that this was a plant that had significant medicinal properties, it became easier to get folks who are more oppositional to understand that this is not the way to go. I will point to one more thing just before. I know we got a lot of questions and stuff, but I just want to give these higher level perspectives that I've reflected on over the years. Something small is like by focusing on the fact that how much law enforcement was spending on cannabis enforcement, marijuana enforcement. That allowed us to really kind of drive home the fact that we have this plant that we know has medicinal benefits, that we know everybody or 50% of the country at least have tried at some point in time, but we have a significant amount of resources from law enforcement going to this activity, right? And so that immediate connection to the cost with the lack of benefit allowed us to take the intermediary step of getting essentially a lot of police departments across the state to make marijuana enforcement our lowest police priority. Now, that to many doesn't seem like a significant act, but in a place where the smell and the odor of marijuana was used incredibly efficiently to bring many tens of thousands of people into the criminal justice system, that was a big step for us. Now, in terms of the major hurdle that moved forward, police liked using the odor. Even though they didn't want to make marijuana arrests, they loved using the odor in order to engage and have a reason to engage with somebody they, for whatever reason, suspected of criminal activity. So they used that odor And we, basically had to continue that fight right up until when the bill was signed. But that first step of getting folks to minimize that, the priority of enforcement was something that was incredibly necessary, and only was successful because of our focus on the narrative of this thing that you all know that is, in Hollywood, that you see on TV, is spending, your law enforcement agencies are spending a bulk of their time doing this. Does that make sense to you? And so that was, a key kind of step that folks may not look at as significant, but I think was incredibly significant in the fight.
Chris, thank you. I want to ask you one more question, and I'm happy to hear you mention the marijuana arrest crusade. I actually worked on that report a million years ago with Harry Levine.
Yeah.
And, we know that having all that data actually didn't necessarily immediately lead to policy change in New York State. So I'm wondering if you can just say a little bit more about what mechanisms and how you used story to really create the change that pushed the lawmakers to actually do the right thing finally, right? What actually did you find really worked here?
Well, I think it's a kind of a bifurcated thing because, as it relates to the medical program and medical marijuana's advancement across the country has always been a precursor to an adult use market rolling out, because that, essentially provided the level of comfort to the public and to lawmakers that this issue is one that, it's not, sky doesn't fall is the language that we use. And so I kind of have to point to the medical program, and the narrative that got the turn on the medical side was, the personal stories, the kids, suffering from cancer, from epilepsy, who, the Compassionate Care New York campaign were bringing up to the halls of Albany every week. And so essentially, parents going to lawmakers saying that, these kids could be helped if they just got out their own way, that definitely turned the tide on the medical side. And I think the normalization of the medical program allowed us to at least have a more stable ground stand on the adult use side. There's one thing that I think is also helpful to point to. Obviously, people think, oh, well, it's the economics, the money, the state's going to make money, and that's the thing. But it really wasn't the driving factor. And at the same time that we were having this debate on legalization, we were also talking about expanding, sports betting, for example, which is a significantly larger revenue pool for the state than legalization. But the one thing that I think was helpful was the way that we structured our campaign, and the way that our bill at the time was structured. It showed that, and we were at a time when the bill passed, that the state was starting to take interest in criminal justice reform. We had just passed our changes to our bail, discovery, and speedy trial laws, and there was this understanding that we can change the approach as it relates to increasing the carceral system, and we can do different things. And so, because of the time of those other long-standing fights, as well as the fact that we've normalized the issue through the medical program, we were able to show the scope of impact that legalization could have. So we pulled in, the immigration advocates to talk about how, cannabis has become the number 4 reason why people were deported. We pulled in the family rights advocates to talk about how, people are getting, 90% of the case, people getting separated from their families, et cetera. And so we also used the moment to pull in all these other places where there was significant intersectionality across issues. And so, that's kind of the campaign side. But I do think the medical program getting up and running, getting normalized, is largely the biggest precursor to significantly changing the narrative in the minds of the lawmakers. Of the people generally, I think it was definitely the sheer mass of arrests being made for something that they know is, everybody has used and is not harmful in that way.
Thank you. It's so helpful to hear all of that. So Quintin, I know you're going to actually walk us through now to better understand what the public perceptions of alternative response really are. So I'm going to turn it over to you to share with us some of your findings.
Yeah, thank you so much. And also thanks to Michael and Chris. I think I'm taking some notes here, and I have a little bit of commentary on the alternative response work that I've been recently engaged in based off of your comments. Really, really helpful and interesting. Just as a bit of brief background, the Joyce Foundation, we supported Lake Research Partners and the Terrence Group to conduct a public opinion poll because we wanted to understand where the public was as it relates to alternative response and co-response. And I think I should note that I use those terms like a little bit differently because I know we're still figuring out what the language is. But when I say alternative response, I mean like a completely non-police response. And then when I say co-response, it's just some type of configuration that has an officer, but also some other kind of professional. And we wanted to see what the public thought of both of those kinds of configurations. And the reason why is because, as most of you probably know, that across the country, there are a number of places that have piloted for some time an alternative response, have piloted or are currently piloting co-response. So, and it seemed like every week that I was learning about a new pilot, and I was like, wow, I wonder, I mean, as things were accelerating in pilot form, I began to think that, well, you know, if there's success, which some of the programs have been really showing some promise, there's going to be an effort or at least a desire to expand and or scale these efforts. And then, of course, when we get to the scaling of efforts, then we really quickly enter into the world of policy and policymakers because it's going to take money. Lots of it, I think, to really implement these programs at scale. So what did we find? We found, just generally speaking, that the public is open to the idea of co-response and alternative response. Roughly about 7 in 10 likely voters said that, yes, they are indeed open to other professionals responding to individuals in crisis. Folks did not, likely voters did not think that these proposals were particularly antagonistic. There's a couple of different sub-bullets to that I'll get to in a second, but overall, likely voters are open to the idea of these different models that differ from traditional police response. We also asked just some basic background questions about, what people even thought of as a first responder. Like, who's a first responder to you? Is it a 911 dispatcher? Would you consider a community violence intervention person a first responder? Do you even know what a community violence intervention person is? And so, we wanted to get an understanding of that. And then also just what likely voters think that the issues are with crime. And then, of course, people's views on just the police themselves. So, like I said, the big top line finding was that about 7 in 10 voters are open to these different approaches, which is very, very promising. They don't seem antagonistic, even though there's still a lot of polarization on the issue. It was pretty remarkable that most likely voters didn't see these as antagonistic. As it relates to who's a first responder, the typical understanding of first responders, people, that's what they understood as first responders, which is police, firefighters, EMT. One thing that was a little bit not unexpected, but something that we found is that the general public really has a favorable view of 911 dispatchers, even though they don't really have a window into what the conditions are and what that job is like and how it does connect to alternative and co-response and even police response. So that is something that we are working on following up about because we thought that was interesting. Another important finding was that the degree to which likely voters feel that police in general want to do the right thing. And that was across race and ethnicity, that was across political affiliation. There wasn't really any indication, in those data that people wanted to completely see police out of the public safety picture. Like that the data doesn't really support that. It does support the idea that perhaps they want police to be repositioned within the public safety infrastructure rather than completely removed from it. And then I think getting to the narrative piece, though, and what I think was perhaps one of the most surprising findings and related to people's opinions about police. We asked people to respond to a number of different scenarios, and not detailed scenarios, but just instances of, say, for example, an assault or an argument or a mental health crisis. And we asked them, in this situation, would you prefer a non-police response, co-police, mostly police, some police, or only police? And I think even though 7 in 10 voters said that they were open to different approaches to first response, it was pretty remarkable the number of scenarios and situations where people said that they would prefer if only police responded to. And I'll give an example. And there were other areas where folks were clear, like, we don't think police should be responding to this. And those fell into a pretty similar bucket, which was mental health crises. The public does not think police are the best to handle that. Substance use issues, and any health-related issue, people just didn't really feel like that police are the absolute best response in those situations. However, as we've been talking about alternative and co-response, I think many people's theory of the case expanded well beyond like health-related matters. For example, there have been increasing attention to traffic stops, routine traffic stops, or things like, we ask people about a blocked driveway, for example, and just incidents that we think like, or an animal, sighting or something like that. So we asked a range of things, and I think that what was surprising to us is that even in a situation, and one of the things that stuck out to most was even in a situation of like a blocked driveway, for example, people overwhelmingly said that they would prefer only a police response. And I was like, that's interesting. And there were many other situations like that where on the surface, you're like, oh, that doesn't seem like a particularly volatile situation. But people, may have interpreted it that way. So there's two ways that we ended up interpreting what could be potential explanations for those findings, which was, one, is that perhaps people think that in situations where there's a possibility that it can escalate to violence, that they would prefer a police response. I guess you can envision an argument and then that argument escalating, so on and so forth. The other thing, though, we thought, and it's really what I think is perhaps more so than even the escalation of violence, is that I don't think the general public and or likely voters have a clear idea of what or who would respond, right? Like, for example, I was trying to make sense of why would people say they don't want police for mental health and other health-related issues, but something like a driveway. So I think part of the answer is that people with health-related issues, particularly mental health, I think people can envision who would show up if not the police. They would probably envision a psychologist, a social worker, a counselor, or something like that. But who exactly comes for a blocked driveway? Who is that person? What do they look like? What type of professionals are they? Who do they work for? You know what I mean? Like, and I think that there's a real gap and sort of understanding the who of alternative response. I think that broadly speaking about the general public, you just don't have a good sense of what that looks like. And so getting to the narrative piece, I think there's, Michael, both you and Chris brought up some very important elements that are part of stories and narratives that, actually advance the objectives. And I think as it relates to alternative response, it seems like we're at a very early stage, right? Because Michael, you talked about being able to state clearly a goal, right? Like, well, I don't know if that goal has been completely stated or if it's without nuance and or complication, because it is the goal to, have a different public safety response. Like, what is the goal? And does that differ with each jurisdiction and differ by geography? Another thing you said, well, what is the strategy? Well, I don't know. And I don't think they know either, right? Like, so what is the strategy? What is the overall goal? I think there are answers to those questions, but I just don't think that they have been figured out completely yet. And even more so, put it before the public for them to, be able to engage with it. So, and then I like the fact about like letting people know how you plan to win, right? And I think again, to narrative related to alternative response is that I'm not sure if we've painted the picture quite yet of what it is we stand to gain from alternative response. Like, what are we winning? Are we winning safer neighborhoods, safer communities? Are we winning? What are we winning? And then with that said, like, how then does my story fit into the broader narrative? Right, like I think that it's we're at a very embryonic stage of this, which makes sense why we perhaps don't have these narratives yet or the examples. And I'll just conclude by saying that I think we all know and what we're up against as far as narrative and stories, right? So I love the idea, at least in my mind, the way you were explaining it, Michael, is that the accumulation of stories actually creates the broader narrative, right? So what stories are part of the narrative? And I think when it comes to public safety, the stories that we see constantly in popular culture, especially where most people live. Most people don't live in our world, right? So what are they seeing? They're seeing law and order. They're seeing CSI. They're seeing, a ton of police movies and a ton, like that is, those are the stories, right? We don't have as many stories of, say, a community care specialist or something coming to de-escalate the situation. Like, I can't point to an episode or lots of episodes where people have seen that in popular culture, and therefore I think we have a lot of work to do if we want to get people support behind this issue. So.
Quintin, you just teed up so much. I'm so excited. We are going to go ahead and
that's a good clean pass there. Love a sport.
You got it all going. We're ready. So we're going to turn the recording off now so that everyone who is participating